The days turned into weeks, but the experience in the forest refused to release its grip on Mark. Every creak of his apartment floorboards, every shadow cast by the streetlights outside, felt like an echo of that oppressive forest. Ethan, on the other hand, had thrown himself into work, determined to distract himself. He avoided conversations about the encounter and didn't answer when Mark brought it up. One evening, Mark sat alone, scrolling through online forums. The email from the anonymous sender still gnawed at his thoughts. Who else had seen it? Were they in danger too? His phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was Ethan. "Mark," Ethan said, his voice tense. "You need to stop whatever you're doing. I got a call today. Some guy asking about the footage." Mark's stomach dropped. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. But he knew too much. He mentioned the clearing, the growls, even the fire we lit that night." Mark frowned. "Did he say who he was?" "No," Ethan replied. "He just kept saying he wanted to confirm the story. I hung up, but now I'm freaked out." Mark stood and began pacing. "This isn't just about us anymore. Someone else knows, Ethan, and if they've seen it too." Ethan cut him off. "Mark, listen to me. Drop this. Forget the forums, the video, all of it. We barely made it out alive. Do you really want to poke the bear?" Mark didn't answer. Ethan sighed heavily. "Just think about it, okay?" The call ended, leaving Mark with a gnawing sense of unease. The next morning, Mark decided to check the footage again, searching for anything he might have missed. As the video played, he froze. There, in the background of a frame he had reviewed a dozen times, was something new, a faint but unmistakable outline of a figure standing among the trees, partially obscured by shadows. He rewound and paused the video, zooming in. The figure was massive, its shoulders broad, its stance unnervingly still. Mark's pulse quickened. How had he missed this before? Before he could think further, his phone buzzed again. It was another email, this time from a different anonymous sender. The subject line read, "They know you saw it." Mark hesitated before opening it. "Stop sharing the footage. Stop looking. It's not just about the creature. There's more going on than you realize." Mark's blood ran cold. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. That evening, Ethan showed up at Mark's apartment unannounced, his face pale and drawn. "I couldn't stay home," he admitted, stepping inside. "I kept hearing things, footsteps outside my window, but no one was there." Mark gestured for him to sit. "I think there's more to this than we thought," he said, showing Ethan the paused video. Ethan stared at the screen, his expression grim. "That's it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's what followed us." Mark nodded. "And someone doesn't want us looking into it. I got another email today." Ethan stood abruptly. "We need to delete the footage. All of it." Mark hesitated, his instinct to preserve the evidence clashing with the growing sense of danger. What if this is our only proof? Ethan shook his head. "What's more important, Mark? Proof or staying alive?" The two spent the night debating their next move. By morning, the footage was still intact, but both men knew time was running out. The forest's secrets had followed them home, and whatever forces were at play weren't finished with them yet. The decision was made. Mark and Ethan agreed to erase the footage. They couldn't risk it getting into the wrong hands, especially with the mysterious emails and unsettling calls they had received. But even as they deleted the files from Mark's laptop, both men knew it wouldn't be enough to erase what they had seen. The forest had left its mark on them. Ethan was the first to speak after the deletion. "That's it then. No more. We need to pretend it never happened." Mark nodded, though he didn't feel any relief. The weight of the creature's presence still loomed in the back of his mind. What was it? Why was it following them? The strange events didn't stop after the footage was gone. Over the next few days, Mark and Ethan each began to notice things they hadn't before. Ethan started hearing noises outside his apartment at night, scratching sounds like claws on wood, faint whispers just beyond the window. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but it happened too often. One night, he got out of bed to check, his flashlight casting weak beams into the empty street. There was nothing, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching him from the shadows. Mark, too, felt it. He was walking to his car when he thought he saw something move in the corner of his eye, a dark figure standing still in the alley. When he turned, there was nothing there, just the empty space between buildings. He dismissed it at first as paranoia, but the nagging feeling remained. Then came the phone calls. It started with one at 3 a.m., a number they didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was distorted, as if the caller was speaking through a broken speaker. "I know you saw it. I know you're still looking." Mark had hung up before the voice could say more. But it wasn't the last time. The calls continued, each one more urgent than the last. No matter how many times they changed their phone numbers, the calls persisted. The same distorted voice, the same chilling message. One night, after another call ended in the same eerie silence, Mark called Ethan. "We can't ignore this anymore. Someone else knows." Ethan was quiet for a long time before he spoke. "Mark, this is getting out of hand. What if we're not the only ones who've seen it? What if this thing has been watching us this whole time?" Mark shivered at the thought. "It's not just Bigfoot, Ethan. There's something else going on here. Something bigger." Ethan was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "I can't keep living like this. I don't know what's real anymore." Mark didn't know what to say. He didn't have the answers, and he knew Ethan was right. They had stepped into something they couldn't control. The next day, they received a visit, an unexpected one. A man in a dark suit appeared at their door, his expression stern and unreadable. He introduced himself simply as Agent Foster and said he worked for an unnamed government agency. "We know what you've been through," he said, his voice low and serious. "And we need to talk." Mark and Ethan exchanged a look. This was it. Mark and Ethan sat across from Agent Foster in Mark's small living room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The man's sharp, calculating eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail before resting on the two friends. "You've attracted some attention," he began, his voice calm but commanding. Mark leaned forward, trying to keep his voice steady. "Who are you, and how do you know about what happened to us?" Foster reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small folder. He opened it, revealing grainy photos of the forest clearing where they had encountered the creature. There were footprints, snapped branches, and even blurry shots of what appeared to be the creature itself. "We've been monitoring that area for years," Foster said. "You two just happened to stumble into something you weren't supposed to." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "What do you mean? Are you saying this thing, Bigfoot, it's real?" Foster nodded slowly. "It's real, but it's not what you think, and you're not the first to encounter it." Mark's heart raced. "Then what is it?" Foster closed the folder and leaned forward, his tone darkening. "Let me make this clear. What you saw is classified. Sharing your story or the evidence you gathered puts not only you, but others in danger." Ethan frowned, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Danger from what? The creature or from you?" Foster's gaze hardened. "Both." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over them. Mark finally broke the silence. "If it's so dangerous, why not contain it? Why let it roam free?" Foster hesitated, his expression unreadable. "It's not that simple. The creature is part of something bigger, an ecosystem, if you will. Removing it could have consequences we can't predict. That's why we monitor, but we don't interfere unless absolutely necessary." Ethan shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "So you just let it terrorize people?" Foster's jaw tightened. "We minimize exposure. But you two, you've drawn too much attention. People are asking questions, and the more attention this gets, the more difficult it becomes to maintain control." Mark leaned back, his mind racing. "So what do you want from us?" Foster's expression softened slightly. "We need your cooperation. Stay quiet. Forget what you saw. If anyone asks, you were on a camping trip, and nothing unusual happened." Ethan scoffed. "And if we don't?" Foster's gaze sharpened again. "Then you'll be putting yourselves, your families, and anyone who listens to you at risk. These things don't just disappear, Mr. Carter, and they don't like being disturbed." The weight of his words hung in the air. Mark and Ethan exchanged a glance, their unspoken fears mirrored in each other's eyes. Foster stood, adjusting his suit. "This is your only warning. Don't make us come back." Without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving the two friends alone with their thoughts. That night, neither of them slept. Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying Foster's words in his mind. The creature wasn't just an anomaly. It was part of something much bigger, something he couldn't begin to comprehend. Ethan, on the other hand, paced his apartment, paranoia creeping into every corner of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that even now the creature, or worse, the people monitoring it, were keeping tabs on them. As dawn broke, Mark made a decision. He picked up the phone and called Ethan. "We need to figure this out," he said, his voice firm. "They're not telling us everything. And if they think we're going to stay quiet, they're wrong." Ethan hesitated before replying. "This is bigger than us, Mark. We could get in serious trouble." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. "We're already in trouble, Ethan. We can't just sit back and pretend this didn't happen." Ethan sighed. "What do you have in mind?" Mark glanced at the folder Foster had accidentally left behind. A single clue that might lead them closer to the truth. We find out what they're hiding. Mark sat at his kitchen table, the folder Foster had left behind spread out in front of him. The man's words echoed in his head. These things don't just disappear. He flipped through the pages again, scanning the blurry photos and cryptic notes. Most of it was indecipherable, jargon and abbreviations that meant nothing to him. But one detail stood out, a hand-drawn map. The map showed the forest they had camped in, but it marked areas that weren't on any official guide. Strange symbols were scattered across it, triangles, X's, and circles, none of which were explained in the notes. Mark quickly grabbed his phone and called Ethan. "Hey," Ethan answered, his voice groggy. "Get over here," Mark said. "I found something." An hour later, Ethan arrived, looking both irritated and exhausted. "You said we were done with this," he said, dropping into a chair. Mark slid the map across the table. "Look at this. Foster left it behind. It's a map of the forest." Ethan frowned, examining the paper. "What are these symbols?" "I don't know," Mark admitted, "but they're marking something. And look, this one here," he pointed to a large X near the center of the map, "is exactly where we saw the creature." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, but he shook his head. "Mark, no, we're not going back there." Mark leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Think about it. Why would they map this area so thoroughly if there wasn't something important going on? Foster said there's an ecosystem, something bigger than just Bigfoot. Don't you want to know what it is?" Ethan hesitated, the fear in his eyes giving way to reluctant curiosity. "And what if we find something we can't handle?" Mark shrugged. "We already have. What's the difference now?" The next day, armed with copies of the map and supplies, Mark and Ethan returned to the forest. The journey felt surreal, as if they were retracing their steps into a nightmare they had barely escaped. The woods were eerily quiet as they followed the map. It led them deeper than they had gone before, into parts of the forest untouched by trails or signs of human activity. After hours of hiking, they reached a clearing marked by one of the symbols on the map, a circle. In the center stood a tree, its trunk carved with strange markings. Ethan stepped closer, running his fingers over the grooves. "These look ancient," he muttered. Mark took photos, his heart pounding. "This isn't just Bigfoot," he said. "This is something older, something no one's supposed to see." The air grew heavy, and both men froze as a low growl rumbled from the shadows. Mark turned slowly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a massive figure slipping between the trees. "It's here," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. The growl came again, closer this time. The friends backed away, their instincts screaming at them to run. As they stumbled out of the clearing, Mark glanced back. The tree stood still, its carvings illuminated by the fading light. But the forest around it seemed alive, watching, waiting. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the forest. Breathless and shaken, they collapsed against a fallen log. Ethan looked at Mark, his face pale. "We can't do this, man. Whatever this is, it's not for us to figure out." Mark didn't respond. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of the mystery. The map, the markings, the creature. They were all connected. And he couldn't shake the feeling that they were closer to the truth than ever before. But at what cost? Mark and Ethan sat in silence for what felt like hours, the distant growl still echoing in their minds. The forest's eerie stillness had followed them to the edge, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. "We need to go back," Mark finally said, breaking the silence. Ethan shot him a look of disbelief. "Are you out of your mind? We barely made it out of there. Whatever that thing is, it's not messing around, Mark." Mark clenched his fists. But we're so close, Ethan. That tree, those markings, they mean something. And this map. He held it up, the paper now crumpled from their frantic escape. This isn't just about Bigfoot. There's something bigger here. Don't you want to know what it is? Ethan rubbed his temples, the stress etched into his face. Mark, sometimes not knowing is better. Foster warned us, remember? He said this thing doesn't like being disturbed. What if we push too far? Mark stared at the map, his determination unwavering. I can't just walk away. Not now. Ethan sighed heavily but didn't argue further. If we're doing this, we need a better plan and more supplies. The next morning, they returned to the forest, this time with a stronger resolve. They carried heavier backpacks filled with extra batteries, stronger flashlights, a first aid kit, and even a small recording device. The trek to the tree took longer than before. Out, the air seemed denser, the shadows darker. The forest felt alive, as if it were aware of their presence. When they reached the clearing, the tree stood as they had left it, towering and ancient, its carvings almost glowing in the dim light. Ethan approached cautiously, his flashlight scanning the bark. What do you think these mean? He asked, tracing one of the symbols. Mark snapped more photos. It looks like a language, or maybe a warning. Whatever it is, it's not random. A sudden noise made them both freeze, a snapping branch, followed by heavy footsteps. Mark turned toward the sound, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam caught something, a fleeting glimpse of fur, a massive shape disappearing into the shadows. It's here, he whispered. Ethan pulled out the recording device, his hands shaking. Do we try to follow it? Mark hesitated. Every instinct told him to run, but his curiosity was stronger. We follow it, carefully. The creature led them deeper into the forest, the path becoming more treacherous with every step. The map provided little guidance now, the markings growing sparser as they moved away from the tree. The footsteps grew fainter, and for a moment, they thought they had lost it. But then, they stumbled upon another clearing. In the center stood a massive stone structure, partially hidden by moss and vines. It looked ancient, its surface covered in the same carvings as the tree. What the hell is this? Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Mark approached the structure cautiously, his flashlight revealing more details. It wasn't just a stone, it was an entrance, a dark, narrow passage leading underground. Ethan backed away. No, absolutely not. There's no way I'm going in there. Mark stared at the opening, his pulse racing. This is it, Ethan. This is what the map was leading us to. Ethan grabbed his arm. Mark, think about this. We don't know what's down there. We barely know what's out here. Mark looked at him, his expression torn. We can't turn back now. Before Ethan could respond, a deep guttural growl came from the passage. The sound was unlike anything they had heard before. Primal, terrifying, and close. Both men froze, their flashlights trained on the darkness. Then, slowly, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the shadows. Mark and Ethan stood paralyzed, their flashlights fixed on the glowing eyes emerging from the darkness of the stone passage. The air seemed to thicken around them, making it hard to breathe. The growl came again, low and menacing, reverberating through their chests. The creature didn't move closer, but its presence filled the clearing, a silent warning not to proceed. Ethan gripped Mark's arm tightly. We have to leave, now. Mark's mind raced. Every part of him screamed to run, but his curiosity tethered him to the spot. It's guarding something, he whispered, his voice trembling. This passage, it's important. Ethan shook his head, panic flashing in his eyes. I don't care what it's guarding, Mark. If we stay here, we're dead. The creature shifted slightly, its massive silhouette becoming clearer in the faint light. It was taller than any man, its fur matted and dark, blending seamlessly with the shadows. Mark swallowed hard, taking a cautious step back. Okay, let's go. Slowly. They began to retreat, their flashlights still trained on the creature. It didn't follow but remained at the entrance, its glowing eyes never leaving them. When they were far enough away, Ethan broke into a full sprint, dragging Mark with him. They didn't stop until they were well beyond the clearing, their lungs burning from exertion. Back at their campsite, they sat in silence, their faces pale and their hands trembling. That thing, it wasn't just an animal, Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. It looked intelligent, like it knew exactly what we were doing. Mark nodded slowly. It was protecting the entrance. That passage, there's something down there, something it doesn't want us to see. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration boiling over. Why are you still thinking about this? We barely made it out of there alive, and you're already planning to go back. Mark looked at him, his determination unwavering. Because we're closer than we've ever been, Ethan. That structure, the creature, it's all connected. If we can figure out what's down there, we'll have the answers we've been searching for. Ethan shook his head, his voice rising. And what if those answers get us killed, Mark? What if Foster was right? Maybe this isn't something we're supposed to know. Mark stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. Maybe. But if we don't try, we'll never know. That night, Mark stayed awake, going over the map again and again. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and curiosity. He knew Ethan was right. They were in over their heads. But the thought of turning back now, of leaving the mystery unsolved, was unbearable. As dawn broke, Mark made a decision. He would go back to the structure, with or without Ethan. When his friend woke up, Mark was already packing his gear. Ethan groaned, rubbing his eyes. You're not seriously doing this. Mark glanced at him, his face set with resolve. I have to. You don't have to come, but I can't leave this unfinished. Ethan stared at him for a long moment before letting out a defeated sigh. You're going to get us killed, you know that? Mark managed a small smile. Probably. But at least we'll know the truth. With their supplies in tow, the two friends set out once more, the tension between them palpable. The journey to the clearing felt even heavier this time, the forest silence pressing down on them like a physical weight. When they arrived, the structure loomed before them, unchanged. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but its presence lingered, a chilling reminder of the danger they faced. Mark approached the entrance cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. If it comes back, we'll run, he said, more to himself than to Ethan. Ethan sighed, gripping his flashlight tightly. Let's just get this over with. They stepped into the passage, the air growing colder with every step. The walls were lined with more carvings, their meanings as mysterious as ever. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The passage seemed to stretch on forever, the light from their flashlights barely penetrating the darkness ahead. Then they heard it, a sound that stopped them in their tracks. A deep, resonant hum, almost like chanting, echoing from somewhere up ahead. Mark exchanged a nervous glance with Ethan. What the hell is that? Ethan shook his head, his face pale. I don't know, but I don't think we should find out. Despite his fear, Mark pressed on, his curiosity outweighing his better judgment. As they rounded a corner, the passage opened into a massive chamber, its walls covered in glowing symbols. In the center of the chamber stood a massive stone altar, its surface etched with the same carvings they had seen on the tree and the structure above. But what caught their attention was what stood behind the altar, a figure shrouded in shadow, its glowing eyes fixed on them. The chamber's eerie glow cast long dancing shadows on the walls as Mark and Ethan froze in place. The figure behind the altar didn't move, but its glowing eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce their very souls. What is that? Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Mark swallowed hard, his hands gripping the flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. I don't know, but it's watching us. The figure let out a low, guttural growl, its massive silhouette shifting slightly. Though its features remained obscured, the sheer size and presence of the creature made it clear they were trespassing on something ancient and powerful. Mark took a cautious step forward, his curiosity warring with his fear. We're not here to hurt you, he said, his voice shaking. We want to understand. Ethan grabbed his arm, his eyes wide with panic. Are you insane? You don't talk to it. You run. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if it were studying them. Then it raised one massive arm and pointed toward the altar. Mark and Ethan exchanged a stunned glance. Did it just gesture? Ethan whispered. Mark nodded slowly. It wants us to look at the altar. Ethan shook his head furiously. No way. This is a trap, Mark. Let's get out of here while we still can. But Mark's curiosity was too strong to ignore. If it wanted to hurt us, it could have already, he reasoned. I think it's showing us something. With trembling hands, Mark stepped closer to the altar. The carvings glowed brighter as he approached, their intricate patterns pulsing with a strange, rhythmic light. Ethan stayed a few steps behind, his flashlight darting between the creature and the altar. "This is a terrible idea," he muttered under his breath. As Mark reached the altar, he noticed a circular indentation in its center, surrounded by symbols. It looked like it was designed to hold something. "What do you think this is for?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Ethan could respond, the creature growled again, louder this time. It stepped closer, its massive form illuminated by the glowing carvings. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Up close, the creature was even more imposing. Its fur dark and matted, its features primal yet intelligent. Its glowing eyes locked onto Mark's, and for a moment, he felt a strange sense of connection, as if the creature were trying to communicate with him. Then it pointed to the map in Mark's hand. Mark hesitated, then unfolded the map. The creature's growl softened, and it gestured again, this time toward a specific symbol on the altar. Ethan stepped closer, his fear giving way to a reluctant curiosity. "It's pointing to that symbol," he said. "What does it mean?" Mark studied the symbol, his mind racing. "It's the same one that was on the tree," he said. "Maybe it's a key or a marker of some kind." Before they could decipher its meaning, the creature let out a sharp, guttural sound and turned abruptly. It moved toward the far end of the chamber, disappearing into the shadows. Mark and Ethan stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had just experienced sinking in. "Do we follow it?" Mark asked. Ethan looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Follow it? Are you kidding me? We're lucky it didn't rip us apart." Mark sighed, his gaze lingering on the shadowy passage where the creature had vanished. "There's more to this, Ethan. It's trying to tell us something." Ethan grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the exit. "I don't care what it's trying to tell us. We've seen enough. Let's get out of here before it changes its mind." Reluctantly, Mark allowed himself to be led back through the passage. But as they emerged into the forest, his mind was already racing with questions, and the unshakable feeling that their encounter was only the beginning. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy as Mark and Ethan sat at their campsite, silent and shaken from the events of the previous night. The encounter with the creature and the glowing altar had left them with more questions than answers. Ethan poked at the campfire with a stick, his brow furrowed. "You know, we could pack up right now. Forget this ever happened. Go home and pretend none of it was real." Mark stared at the map spread out before him, his finger tracing the symbol the creature had pointed to. "You really think we can just walk away from this? We've seen too much." Ethan let out a frustrated sigh. "And what exactly have we seen? A giant creature, some creepy glowing carvings? None of it makes any sense, Mark. People are going to think we're crazy." Mark looked up at him, his eyes filled with determination. "Maybe, but what if we're not? What if this is the key to proving everything we've been searching for?" Ethan shook his head, exasperated. "I don't even know what this is." "And neither do you." Mark held up the map, pointing to the marked locations. "Look at this. The symbol it showed us, it's connected to these other spots. If we can figure out what they mean, maybe we'll understand why it's guarding that altar." Ethan hesitated, his resolve wavering. He hated to admit it, but Mark's curiosity was infectious. "Fine," he said reluctantly, "but if we run into that thing again, I'm out." "I mean it, Mark." Mark nodded, folding the map carefully. "Deal. Let's start with the closest marker. It's only a few miles from here." The hike was grueling, the terrain growing steeper and more treacherous as they neared their destination. The forest seemed eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects replaced by an oppressive silence. "Does it feel off to you?" Ethan asked, his voice hushed. Mark nodded. "Yeah, like we're being watched." They pressed on, their unease growing with every step. When they finally reached the marker, they found themselves standing before a massive stone monolith, its surface covered in carvings identical to those on the altar. Mark approached it cautiously, running his fingers over the grooves. "It's the same style," he said, "but these symbols are different." Ethan hung back, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest. "Do you think it's another piece of the puzzle?" Mark nodded, studying the carvings intently. "It has to be. Look at this. It's pointing toward another location." He traced a line in the carvings, which seemed to form a crude map. "This could be the next marker." Ethan groaned. "More hiking? Great." Before Mark could respond, a branch snapped nearby, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. Both men froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, as if something massive were moving just out of sight. Mark whispered, "Do you see it?" Ethan shook his head, his hand tightening on the flashlight. "No, but it's there. I can feel it." The tension was unbearable, every second dragging out like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the movement stopped. The forest fell silent once more. Ethan exhaled shakily. "We need to leave. Now." Mark hesitated, torn between his fear and his curiosity. But the memory of the creature's glowing eyes was enough to convince him. "Okay," he said, "let's go." They hurried back the way they had come, the sense of being followed never leaving them. By the time they reached the safety of their campsite, both men were on edge, their nerves frayed. Ethan dropped his pack and collapsed onto a log. "I told you this was a bad idea." Mark sat beside him, staring at the map. "We're close, Ethan. I can feel it. Whatever's out there, it's trying to lead us somewhere." Ethan shook his head, his expression grim. "Or it's trying to warn us to stay away." Night had fallen by the time Mark and Ethan decided to rest. The fire crackled softly, its warm glow offering a fragile sense of security against the dark wilderness. Despite their exhaustion, neither man could sleep. The oppressive feeling of being watched hung heavy in the air. Ethan poked at the fire with a stick, his face tense. "We can't keep doing this, Mark. I don't know what's out there, but it's not just some animal. It's something else." Mark sat across from him, his flashlight in hand. "I know, but it's not attacking us, Ethan. If it wanted to, it would have done it by now." Ethan shook his head. "That doesn't mean it's safe. Maybe it's waiting for the right moment." The woods were eerily silent, the usual nighttime sounds of crickets and owls absent. It was as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Then a sound broke the stillness, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around them. Mark and Ethan froze, their eyes darting toward the shadows beyond the firelight. The growl grew louder, more distinct, until it was clear that something massive was circling their camp. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the darkness, his hand trembling. "Do you see anything?" Mark squinted into the trees, his heart pounding. "No, but it's close." The growling stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps. The ground seemed to tremble with each step, the weight of the creature unmistakable. Mark and Ethan stood, their backs to the fire as they scanned the shadows. "Stay calm," Mark whispered, though his own voice betrayed his fear. The footsteps stopped just beyond the edge of the firelight. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, two glowing eyes appeared in the darkness. Ethan gasped, his flashlight shaking as he pointed it toward the creature. But the beam barely penetrated the shadows, revealing only a hulking silhouette. Mark took a cautious step forward, his hands raised. "We don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. The creature growled again, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. It stepped closer, its massive form partially illuminated by the firelight. Ethan took a step back, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mark, don't. Just stay back." But Mark held his ground, his gaze locked on the creature. "I think it's trying to tell us something," he said. The creature tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. Then, to their astonishment, it reached down and picked up a fallen branch. "What the?" Ethan began, but he stopped as the creature began drawing in the dirt with the branch. Mark and Ethan watched in stunned silence as the creature scratched out a crude symbol, a circle with intersecting lines. "It's the same symbol from the altar," Mark whispered. The creature pointed to the drawing, then gestured toward the woods. Mark turned to Ethan, his eyes wide. "It wants us to follow it." Ethan's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious. We're not following that thing." Mark looked back at the creature, his mind racing. What if it's leading us to answers? To the truth about all of this? Ethan shook his head vehemently. Or to our deaths? Before they could decide, the creature let out a low grunt and began walking into the forest. It paused at the edge of the firelight, turning to look back at them. Mark took a step forward, his heart pounding. "I'm going," he said. Ethan grabbed his arm, his voice desperate. "Mark, please, don't do this." Mark hesitated, then gently pulled free. "I have to. This might be our only chance to understand." He followed the creature into the darkness, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the trees. Ethan stood frozen, torn between his fear and his loyalty to his friend. After a moment of agonizing indecision, he let out a frustrated sigh and grabbed his pack. "Wait up," he called, running to catch up with Mark. "If you're going, I'm not letting you do it alone." Unknown Mark and Ethan followed the creature deeper into the forest, their flashlights casting long, flickering shadows across the trees. The creature moved with surprising agility for its massive size, its glowing eyes occasionally turning back to ensure they were still following. Ethan muttered under his breath, "I can't believe I'm doing this. This is insane." Mark glanced at him. "We've come this far, Ethan. Whatever this thing is, it's trying to show us something. We have to see it through." The path grew narrower, the trees pressing in around them. The air was heavy and damp, carrying a faint, earthy scent that seemed oddly out of place. After what felt like an eternity, the creature stopped at the edge of a clearing. It turned to face them, its glowing eyes flickering as it gestured toward the open space ahead. Mark and Ethan stepped forward cautiously, their flashlights illuminating a sight that took their breath away. The clearing was dominated by a massive stone structure, half buried in the earth and covered in moss and vines. Strange symbols were etched into the surface, glowing faintly in the darkness. At the center of the structure was an opening, a dark, yawning hole that seemed to lead underground. Ethan took a step back, his voice trembling. "What is this place?" Mark stared at the structure, awe and curiosity battling with fear. "It's incredible. It looks ancient." The creature let out a low growl and pointed to the opening. Mark hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but his curiosity won out. "It wants us to go inside." Ethan grabbed his arm. "No way, Mark. This is where we draw the line. We don't know what's down there." Mark looked at him, his expression resolute. "That's exactly why we need to go. This could be the key to everything. The symbols, the sightings, the creature itself. We can't stop now." Ethan shook his head, his fear evident. "This isn't curiosity anymore, Mark. This is suicide." The creature growled again, its glowing eyes narrowing as it pointed more insistently toward the opening. Mark turned back to the structure, taking a deep breath. "You don't have to come with me, Ethan, but I'm going in." Ethan stared at him, torn between his fear and his loyalty. After a moment, he sighed heavily. "Fine, but if we die down there, I'm haunting you." Mark smiled faintly. "Deal." The descent into the structure was steep and treacherous, the narrow tunnel forcing them to move single file. The air grew colder and heavier with each step, and the faint glow of the symbols provided just enough light to guide their way. Ethan muttered, "This is a terrible idea. I just want to state that for the record." Mark didn't respond, his focus entirely on the path ahead. The tunnel eventually opened into a cavernous chamber, the walls covered in more of the glowing symbols. At the center of the chamber was a raised platform, surrounded by what appeared to be crude stone carvings of the creature itself. Mark and Ethan approached the platform cautiously, their flashlights sweeping across the chamber. This is a shrine," Mark whispered. Ethan frowned. "A shrine? To what? The creature?" Mark nodded, his mind racing. "It must be. This whole place, it's like a temple. But why?" Before they could speculate further, the creature entered the chamber, its massive form casting long shadows across the walls. It moved to the platform and placed a hand on the carvings, letting out a low, mournful sound. Mark stepped closer, his voice soft. "It's protecting this place. That's why it's been so aggressive. It's guarding something." Ethan crossed his arms, his skepticism returning. "Guarding what exactly? There's nothing here but rocks and symbols." The creature turned to face them, its glowing eyes filled with an intensity that made both men take a step back. It raised its hand, pointing to the ceiling of the chamber. Mark and Ethan followed its gaze, their flashlights revealing a massive symbol etched into the stone above them. It was the same circle and line design from the map, but more intricate, with additional markings that seemed to tell a story. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "This is it. This is what it's been trying to show us." Ethan frowned, his unease growing. "What does it mean?" Mark shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's important." End of part 2.